All right, welcome and good afternoon. We're going to get started here. Today we have the privilege of having Henry Olsen, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He studies and provides commentary on American politics, and his work focuses on how to address the electoral challenges facing the modern American conservatism. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the National Review, and Weekly Standard, among others, and he's currently writing a book titled New Century, New Deal: How Conservatives Can Win the Hearts, Minds, and Elections. He has some interesting thoughts for us on the upcoming presidential election, specifically regarding the Republican Party and the frustration of millions of working class voters. So please join us in welcoming Henry Olsen.
Yes, there are two people in the United States that I look to for the best analysis of what actually is happening in politics. One is Michael Barone, the other is Henry Olsen, so we're very privileged to have Henry here today. And let me start by doing a little poll right here. I'm not going to ask you all what your preference is for president, but I'm going to ask you for your analysis. That is, how many of you think that come July in Cleveland, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee? It's not, again, whether you like him or not, it's just what you think is going to happen. Okay, so we see a bunch of hands. How many of you think Ted Cruz will be the Republican nominee? Okay, not a whole lot. How many of you think John Kasich will be the Republican nominee? Okay, no one raised hands that I saw. Okay, and of course, most of you are undecided or unwilling to commit or something like that. What we're going to do right now is first run through sort of the basic analysis that Henry has done, looking at four groups of Republican voters. Then we're going to take a brief look back at the past few weeks or so, and then we're going to ask for predicting the future. Again, you know, lots of people do number one. Some people can do number two well. No one can really do number three very well, but Henry Olsen here is going to put it all on the line.
Good.
Give us prophecies, and we'll know soon what's going to happen. So, okay, first, the basic analysis in the Republican Party, four groups.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about the largest group, you say, somewhat conservative.
Right. Not only are they the largest group historically, what's notable about this race is that the somewhat conservatives have increased their share of the electorate by nearly 10 points. Okay. That traditionally they have been 35 to 40% of the electorate nationally. Now they're pushing 45 to 50%. These are voters who are not movement conservatives. They are people who traditionally were the Bush voters, the Romney voters. This is the group, however, that this election is putting Donald Trump. He carries them in almost every state. And what they clearly are people who value action and value some conservative principles, but also value a sense of citizenship and are not moved by their religious beliefs primarily to cast their votes. So they are conservative, but not in the way that the Heritage Foundation or Freedom Works or the Family Research Council would define conservatism.
They think we're in a tough situation and we need a tough guy?
Traditionally, they have liked people like Jeb Bush. They have liked people like John Kasich. They have not liked people like Senator Ted Cruz. What's happening this time is there's a split. There are people close to a majority who like Donald Trump. And then there are people who are a substantial minority who prefer some combination of Kasich and Rubio. What's notable here is that Ted Cruz continues, even as the race has gone on, to not only lose this group to Trump, but often lose them to either Rubio or Kasich. They simply do not find him appealing as a first-order choice. So I'd say there's the traditional somewhat conservative, who I call the Boehner conservative, and these are the people who they liked Bush, they've turned to Kasich or Rubio, they'll now probably turn to Kasich as the last person standing. And then there's the person who doesn't usually vote in primaries, who I would call the casual conservative. The person who say they're conservative, but they're not active Republicans in the primary election, and they love Donald Trump.
Okay. Then the second largest group you might think would be, from what we read in the press, conservative evangelicals, but actually it's not. What's the second largest group?
The second largest group traditionally has been moderates, that they've been 25 to 30% of the electorate nationally, and in some cases up to 40 to 50%. Again, this is another one of those things that has changed for the first time in 20 years. In this election, the share of moderates is down by 8 to 10 points. They're still as large as very conservative evangelicals in most states outside the South. They are a very underappreciated group. In some places, they're larger. New England, they are still larger, even though they're smaller. But this is the group that's they are antithetical to everything that the very conservative evangelicals want. The very conservative evangelicals want tax cuts. This group wants balanced budgets. Very conservative evangelicals are pro-life. This group is pro-choice. Very conservative evangelicals care a lot about religious liberty. This group thinks live and let live. The religious people should follow the law. Every step down the way, the moderates are the yin to the very conservative evangelical yang. And this has been John Kasich's base of support throughout the primaries.
Okay. And the third largest group are the very conservative evangelicals.
Exactly.
And define exactly how that works.
Yeah, these are people who tell pollsters that they are both very conservative in their politics and evangelical in their religion. They are 25% or so of the electorate nationwide, but they are larger than that in all of the states of the Deep South and all of the states of the Border South and in Midwestern caucus states. That when we have caucuses rather than primaries, we know both on the Democratic and the Republican side that more committed ideological people are a larger share of the electorate. And in Midwestern states, those tend to be very conservative evangelicals. These are people who are probably, like a number of you, place a high priority on what used to be called social issues. They value life over choice on abortion. They value traditional marriage over same-sex marriage. They value judicial restraint over judicial activism. They feel threatened by a coarsened and secular society, which they believe, and I'm saying this in an analytical way. I'm not trying to, by using they in any way, describe any distance between myself. It's just I can speak as an analyst if I can look at each group without emotion. And they very much want people to say that their religious faith animates their life in the public square. And this has been Ted Cruz's base throughout the election, that he has targeted them. He basically pushed aside their previous favorites, Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum, with amazing ease, I might add. And wherever this group is strong, Ted Cruz runs well. Wherever this group is weak, Ted Cruz runs poorly. This is both the boon and the bane for his campaign. It's what's gotten him this far, but there are now very few states where they are a large segment of the electorate. They are not a large segment of the electorate in most of the Northeast. They are not a large segment of the electorate in the Pacific Northwest. They are not a large segment of the electorate in Arizona. This is his challenge, how to expand beyond the group that so far has been the lady that brought them to the dance.
Okay, and then the smallest group are the very conservative secular.
That's right. These are the people who you'd think were much larger. These are the soft libertarians, the Rand Paul people, the Club for Growth people, the Steve Forbes people, the people who love supply-side economics. In fact, what we find is there are very few Republican voters who are motivated by that. The sort of people who champion those issues as their priorities almost always lose early. Rand Paul was yet another example of that. Steve Forbes was the example in '96 and 2000. What happens is that there aren't enough people who care about that as their first order to propel one of those people into the final round. And so consequently, they're always the voting bloc without a home.
Okay. Now, two questions of definition. First, evangelicals. I've seen estimates of the number of evangelicals ranging from 6%, if you actually ask people, what do you believe, and so forth, up to 40% if you talk about very loose identification, are you born again, and so forth. What would you say is the percentage of evangelicals in America?
The only way, we have to use exit poll data, and exit poll data are very loose. The definition that we used in our book is self-described, answer to the question, do you describe yourself as a born again or evangelical Christian? Now, so this leads to a very wide description. That in Mississippi, for example, 80% of Republican primary voters answer that question yes. But what we also do, which we can't do until a couple of years later when we can get the access to the data files, is then take, if questions are asked about religiosity, how frequently do you attend church, you then can get a subset of that. And what we find is a subset of people who are in fact more deeply motivated by their evangelical Christianity in their voting preferences. If we had better data about the sort that Pew, if the exit polls ask the sort of questions that the Pew Center asks about beliefs and structures and importance, we would probably get a much more smaller number and much more robust findings as far as their actual influence.
So I've seen a little bit of data, I don't know how it's derived, indicating that people who go to church once a week or more often and are conservative tend to be Cruz voters. People who don't go to church tend to be Trump voters. I mean, evangelicals, self-declared, who don't go to church tend to be Trump voters.
Yeah, that's correct. That Cruz support varies positively with religious practice, defined by church attendance. That if you are both, there's a couple of questions the exit polls asked. One is how important is it to you that a candidate shares your religious values? The more important it is, the better Ted Cruz does. The less important it is, the worse Ted Cruz does. For Donald Trump, it is exactly the opposite. Also, you have the question on religious attendance. The more often you go to church, if you are also evangelical, the more often you are to vote for Ted Cruz. That is not true if you're Catholic, but it is true if you're evangelical Christian. Donald Trump does well among non-believers, non-practitioners, and Catholics.
Okay, and then my second question of definition, defining conservative. We've heard a lot about immigration this year. Are people who are wanting first and foremost, the wall, are they more conservative than, let's say, someone who has a different position on immigration, but let's say is strongly pro-life? How do you hash this?
Yeah, conservative in the exit polls is something that is in the eye of the respondent. Okay. It is not something that the exit polls trying to find. If you say you're conservative, you are conservative. This, of course, leads to a lot of angst, in the sense that you'll say somebody will say they're conservative and they favor, immigration wall and some conservatives will say, well, you're not really a conservative. So when we look at the data, we can't get below that. What we know is that immigration, when asked, is always the least important single issue to voters, even in this election, that they choose other issues before immigration, like terrorism or government spending. Those who choose immigration, however, are wild Trump supporters.
Okay. And then just one other question is...
One thing I would say is that what you see is kind of, with the different candidates, is the differing definitions that people internally have about what is the core of conservatism is coming out in which candidates they choose, even if we don't quite have the data to allow us to describe it with precision.
Okay. Is adultery really a dead issue entirely in American politics? After all, back in 1963, when Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York was in many ways probably the favorite to get the nomination the next year, and then he got divorced, and that killed his candidacy. Yeah. I mean, that was just, now is it completely irrelevant in the eyes of voters or just about all voters?
I think past adultery is. I think divorce is an irrelevant consideration. I mean, certainly one of the things that made Rockefeller's divorce more poignant was not only that he was divorced, but he remarried a woman who had been involved in his circle, who was many years younger, and she gave birth to their first child on the weekend before the California primary. So it was like all of that coming together. But I think if you were divorced, that is an irrelevant question to the vast majority of voters. I think past adultery is a irrelevant question to a vast majority of voters. I think current adultery would be different, but there's no allegation pending that any of the people in the race are currently involved in an adulterous affair.
Okay, so in other words, just take another historical example, Gary Hart in 1987, which was current adultery, or at least perceived as such. That you think would still have an effect if one of the candidates went on a boat called Monkey Business.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think that would still have an effect. You also have the circumstances that Gary Hart basically said, I'm not having an affair, and you can follow me around and try and prove that I am. And then they followed him around and proved that he was. So
Right.
there was an element of credibility
Okay.
along with that. But yeah, I do think that current adultery would be something that people would take into account. But it's not 1963. One of the
Right.
things that however, what I will say about that is that according to Pew Research data, that there is much more support for divorce, much less belief that people should keep the marriage together for the sake of the children, much less opposition to sex outside of marriage over the last 40 years. However, there is much less tolerance of infidelity than there was.
Okay.
It is the one social indicator where traditional values have gained support rather than lost support over the last 40 years. And I think what you would see is, depending on the circumstances of the affair, is that it would become something that could be quite important.
Okay. Okay, part two then, looking at the recent past. What happened to Marco Rubio, who a year ago looked to be the great shining ascending star of the Republican Party?
Yeah.
What happened?
Rubio never really communicated a strong reason why people should vote for him. I think Rubio was somebody who was he was positioning himself in a way to be everyone's second choice. In order to get through the presidential primaries, as we talk about in our book, you have to be what we called in our book a faction favorite. It means you have to have one of these four voter groups. Or I think what Trump has done since we wrote the book is add a fifth faction, which we can talk about if you want to. But you have to have the passionate loyalty of one of these four voter groups. Now, if you want to be passionately loved by one of these groups, you have to be willing to risk being unloved by one of these groups. And John Kasich has made the choice that he is going to be passionately loved by moderates in the Republican Party and independents who are willing to switch between parties. And that means that he has chosen that he will not be loved by the very conservative groups.
And Ted Cruz has done the opposite.
And Cruz has made the opposite calculation. Rubio was never willing to make that choice. And by not making that choice, he never became a faction's favorite to the degree that he just had that large margin of victory among that group that would propel him into the top tier. So he basically, by trying to be acceptable to everyone, he was acceptable to everyone, and he finished second or third everywhere, and that's why he's not running.
Okay. So in earlier years, Jeb Bush promoted Rubio's candidacy. This year, he very actively fought against it.
Yes.
Even after he was out. Why?
The Bush family has a very strong sense of loyalty. Once you're in, you cannot really exercise independent judgment. And I think they view that this was now Jeb's time, that Marco was younger, that he, as somebody who had been promoted by the Bush clan, owed the Bush clan loyalty, and he broke that. So consequently, it became really a grudge match between the two camps. And I think you can take a look at, there were tactical reasons why Bush needed to take on Marco Rubio, but the degree of focus on Rubio, while ignoring Kasich, who was also taking away Bush's voters, the degree of animus that would be given off background to reporters about the way they felt about Rubio clearly demonstrates that there was something other than purely unemotional thinking going on. He was somebody who didn't wait his turn and needed to be slapped down.
Okay. Will Chris Christie's legacy be, number one, that he took out Rubio in a debate, and number two, that he then endorsed Trump and was promptly indicated by Trump to be something that you would wipe off your feet if you were walking down the streets of New York City?
Yeah. Absent a Trump presidency where Christie can redeem himself as Attorney General, Christie is going to go down as somebody who threw away the chance to be the nominee in 2012. I think at that point, when he was basically begged by secular Tea Party groups and the somewhat conservative establishment to be the choice against Romney, and he chose not to take it, that he made the biggest mistake of his life. And to get in as he did and then not effectively make a case for himself in a crowded field, that he will be known as the person who could have been president and wasn't, and took down another person who could have been president, and so far it looks like won't be.
Okay. And Donald Trump, the deal maker, what kind of deals do you think he's offering people right now?
I don't think he's offering deals as much as offering people the ability to think that they can make a deal. That what you want to do right now, since in any presidential campaign, there are more people who want to strike high-level deals with you than you can strike. There's only a limited amount of high-level patronage to give around. You want to maximize the number of people who think that they can get that. So that's what these phone calls, these offers are basically meant to say is, don't be my enemy, I'm willing to treat you as my friend, and we can work out the details later. I think the closer we get to the convention, the more he will have to make some hard commitments in order to avoid having people team up against him or make things highly uncomfortable for him. But at this stage, he's like a conquering army that has swept aside all of the armies that have been before him, and he's coming up to the city, and he's sending emissaries to say, I'm not going to behead the burghers, I'm not going to behead the mayor, as long as you're willing to lay down your arms. Okay. What he's going to do with them later is left unsaid, but he's basically trying to send out enough feelers so that people lay down their arms.
Okay. And what do you make of another thing that surprised a lot of people, Ben Carson's endorsement of Trump?
I think it's an indication that he is somebody who is very smart but very unschooled in politics. It could very well be for him that personal animus plays a part in this, which is that he has convinced himself that Ted Cruz did him in Iowa because of the Cruz campaigns sending a false rumor around that Carson was going to get out of the race. Carson's voters were demographically very similar to Cruz's voters, which is to say that if you were very religious, conservative, evangelical, and you were not behind Cruz at that point, you were highly likely to be behind Carson. So anyone in the Cruz campaign would know that, and they would know that if you can depress Carson's vote, Cruz will be the second choice. So it could very well be that Carson looks out at the state of the race and says, basically, I have to endorse either Trump or Cruz, and that over my dead body will I endorse that lying SOB.
Okay. So Marxists and materialists like to talk about the great forces of history and inevitability in that sense. I hear you basically saying, in many ways, don't underestimate the importance of individuals and their own animosities, peaks, anger, and so forth.
No, I mean, one of the things that I think we tend to lose track of a couple of things when we talk about modern American politics. The first thing we lose track of is that the voters matter. Is that if I were simply to, without any background in politics, listen to the way the media reports campaigns, I would think that I don't matter. It's all these people playing these games and these slogans, and they're trying to, woo me, and I would think that this is a game of supply rather than demand. And what I'm doing in the book and in my writing is trying to say, no, actually demand is driving supply. That the reason Donald Trump exists is because there has been, and I was writing about this for years before Trump came out, is that there was this unmet demand in American politics for people who would bring the native-born Americans who have been threatened and hurt by the forces of the last 20 years, globalization and competition, and say, you're part of America too. And this was an unmet demand. It was there for anyone to see, and every single person chose not to see it except for the person who was untied to any existing faction, which tends to be what happens in American politics, is that just like it was hard for General Motors to see the trends that a new entrant could see in any business. Existing incumbents find it hard to break out of the mindset and the habits that got them there in the first place. Donald Trump could see something that any sensible person should have been able to see, but he got there and set afire the dry bush or the dry grass that had been lying there for a long time. But So one, demand matters, voter matters. Two, individual choices matter a lot. That people make choices, as candidates, that individual feelings and self-belief matters, and that both enables and limits their ability to become president. That personal characteristics, great men or not so great men and women, matter a lot.
So this reminds me of that famous article from about 50 years ago by Thomas Kuhn called the structure of scientific revolutions. That it's the outsiders, in a sense, who are able to see at certain times that the emperor has no clothes and here's an opportunity to develop something new, whereas settled science, including settled political science, and settled politicians tend to overlook the opportunities because they are tied to the...
They're either tied by incentives or, I read Kuhn's book when I was in college, or either their minds are rigid and they're engaging in what we now would call confirmation bias, which say they see a new piece of evidence and rather than examining it, they fit it in and try and make it consistent with what they already believe. Yeah. It's partly that and partly incentives, that even if you see it, so many people are tied into a system that says that you would have to move other people in a way in order to take a risk. And people are unwilling to take risks and they don't see it, and the paradigm gets broken from the outside rather than reformed from the inside.
Yeah. Okay then, part 3, predicting the future.
Yes. Let's
start with next Tuesday. Arizona and Utah next up in primaries. Who's going to win?
Utah should be an easy victory for Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz took nearly 50%. The thing to remember about Utah is it's a Mormon state. And Mormons are non-evangelical in their theology, but otherwise have many belief structures that are very similar to evangelical Christians. What we saw in the Idaho primary, Idaho is the state that has the second largest number of Mormons in the country, is that counties with 70 to 90% Mormon populations voted very heavily for Cruz and very much against Trump. Their second choice was Rubio. There's no reason to think that Utah, which is even more Mormon, will make a different choice. Cruz will win with over 50% of the vote, and he will get 40 delegates. Arizona is a classic Trump state. It is a state with high degree of immigration, which creates social anxiety. If there's a place that wants a wall, it's an Arizona Republican Party. It's notable that it is the one place where Trump actually got early backing from the former governor, Jan Brewer. She knows what her state is like.
He always mentions the sheriff.
And he always mentions Joe Arpaio, who is the tough law and order anti-immigrant sheriff of Maricopa County, which is the county where Phoenix is and is the county that casts 60% of the Republican vote. Whoever carries Maricopa County will carry the state. And it's also a state that got wiped out in the real estate crash. So you have economic anxiety and social anxiety. I would expect Trump to win this by 10 to 15 points. If he wins by anything less than 10 points, it's a sign of weakness going forward as opposed to strength.
Okay, and so the press reports the next day are Cruz wins one state, Trump wins one state, and on it goes.
Right.
Right. On it goes.
The press reports will also note that there were 98 delegates at play between the two states, and Trump will win 58 and Cruz will win 40, which means that Trump will get closer. So there will be, yes, 1-1, but it will also be, and Trump gains ground in his quest for a majority.
Okay. And the following week is Wisconsin.
2 weeks.
Two weeks.
The next state is Wisconsin, but it's 2 weeks.
2 weeks, okay. And that's when interesting things start to percolate.
This is where it's going to become, one of two things will happen. Either John Kasich's campaign will flare out in a moment, in a burst of glory, or what I think is the much likelier one is the national media and the Republican Party will suddenly realize there are 3 candidates in the race. Wisconsin is a state where evangelical Christian conservative candidates go to die. It's where Rick Santorum went and lost by 8 points to Mitt Romney. It's where Mike Huckabee went and lost by more than that to John McCain. It is a state that historically has had one of the higher percentages of moderates. It is a state that has a large number of Catholics who vote Republican, and moderates and Catholics don't vote in large numbers for evangelical conservative candidates who can't offer more. Like George W. Bush offered more. But for candidates who are so clearly defined in that way, which is the way Senator Cruz has defined himself, this is a place where they go to die. What that means is that you'll have, it's also a state that has lots of blue-collar Republicans. It is a state that has racial tensions because of Milwaukee, a large African-American population, and a very highly segregated population. It's a place with a lot of downscale blue-collar workers in what's known as the Fox River Valley, which is a collection of small towns. You know, Oshkosh Bagosh. People will go to Oshkosh to learn what the blue-collar Republican thinks. Or Racine, Paul Ryan's district. Trump will do very well in these places. He will do well in rural Wisconsin, battling Ted Cruz for domination there. He will do well in small-town Wisconsin, battling Cruz for domination there. And then we'll get to Milwaukee. And this is John Kasich country. This is where moderate, upscale, educated Republicans live. This is where, in every race so far, John Kasich has done very well. He beat Ted Cruz in metropolitan Chicago, which is 90 miles south. He beat Ted Cruz in metropolitan Detroit. John Kasich will keep Ted Cruz from winning anything in metropolitan Milwaukee. And the only question is whether Kasich can do well enough to take congressional districts. I expect what's going to happen there is Trump will win with between 35 and 40% of the vote. He may win all 9 congressional districts. These are all 8 congressional districts. And if he does, it will be precisely because where Cruz is strong, Trump is stronger. The 8 to 10% of the vote Kasich will get in Wausau and rural Wisconsin will keep Cruz from winning the vote there. And Kasich and Cruz will split the anti-Trump vote in suburban Milwaukee. And at that moment, the Republican Party will wake up and realize that they have a real problem.
You're saying that they haven't awakened yet and said they have a real problem, or?
No, the Republican, particularly the Cruz campaign, still doesn't understand the magnitude of the task ahead of them.
Okay.
They don't, no one in this campaign has figured out how to deal with John Kasich.
Okay. After Wisconsin.
Figuring out how to deal with John Kasich is going to be the key to being able to stop Donald Trump from getting 1,237 delegates.
So after Wisconsin, does John Kasich start to get some strange new respect?
That's the question. If John Kasich does what I think he's going to do, if he does well enough to win 2 or 3 of the congressional districts in Milwaukee, he starts to gain strength. If, on the other hand, he is somebody who doesn't win anything but is clearly an urban spoiler, then there'll be pressure on him to get out, because there will no longer be a margin for error. New York votes 2 weeks after that, and the 5 northeastern moderate states vote a week after New York. If Kasich can win congressional districts in Wisconsin, or ideally for him finish a close second, then that gives him momentum going into the northeast states to say, Ted, you can't compete here, I can. You're the one who needs to get out. But if he doesn't, then it's really a conundrum. If he's somebody who ends up being a spoiler, there'll be a lot of pressure on him. There'll be arguments both ways, that each of the other candidates needs to get out in favor of the other. The Kasich people will say, look, Ted, you're the spoiler. We would have carried suburban Milwaukee. We would have won the state because I'm the candidate best positioned to win the states going forward, and Cruz would make exactly the opposite question. It'll be a massive, very intense discussion that'll go on after Wisconsin.
So then you really can't forecast what's going to happen in New York and those other eastern states?
No.
You will?
Well, I will.
We will. Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, because I'll give you 2 alternatives.
Okay.
The one alternative is that, well, I'll give you 3 alternatives. One is that it remains a 3-person race. If it's a 3-person race, Kasich wins a number of congressional districts in the New York metropolitan area. Cruz is competitive in 1 or 2 of the upstate districts. Donald Trump sweeps the board. If Cruz gets out or says, I'm not going to campaign in the Northeast, I'll keep my campaign going, but Cruz supporters anywhere, anywhere on the Eastern Seaboard vote for John Kasich, then John Kasich is going to do extremely well in New York. That he could carry the state. He will definitely carry a large number of congressional districts, and that will give him a lot of momentum. If, on the other hand, Kasich gets out, Donald Trump will carry New York. The man who criticized a candidate for representing New York values should not expect to win New York votes. And that means Cruz will come out with only a couple of congressional districts at best in the upstate, and he'll be wiped out in the delegate count coming out of New York. So then let's go forward to the next scenario. If all three candidates are in the race, then we've got the same thing playing out, which is Connecticut, Rhode Island, very good Kasich states, could be competitive. Cruz could keep him from winning. Delaware would be a state that Kasich again would do well, probably lose to Trump, however, because of the three-way race. Kasich is going one-on-one, he wins those states. And he runs very well with Trump in Pennsylvania, losing some congressional districts, but maybe carrying the state. And the same in Maryland. John Kasich can win Maryland if it's a one-on-one race. If John Kasich gets out, Ted Cruz gets pasted everywhere. He wins some congressional districts in the highly religious parts of Pennsylvania, but he loses the state badly and loses most of the congressional districts. He loses 6 or 7 of Maryland's 8 congressional districts, and he loses Connecticut and Rhode Island badly, and it becomes very clear at that point that Ted Cruz cannot win the nomination.
So the Cruz campaign claims that they really want to go one-on-one against Donald Trump. That's really silly, is that?
The Cruz campaign does not understand how the Midwest and the Northeast differs from the rest of the country. Okay. That they also do not understand how unappealing Ted Cruz is to the sort of Republican who is the decisive voter in those areas. That if forced to choose between the sort of moderate, non-religious, or moderately conservative, non-evangelical Christian who lives in Nassau County is going to look at Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and say, why am I in this party? And in that case, might they be likelier to vote for the New Yorker rather than the Texan? You betcha.
Okay. So the logical deal to be struck against the king dealmaker, Donald Trump, would be essentially a Cruz-Kasich cartel.
Yes.
And what do you think that's going to happen?
I think it's highly unlikely to happen because of the egos of the individuals involved. I like to say that Ted Cruz spells team I.
And John Kasich spells team?
John Kasich knows how to play as a team, but this is also a shot at the presidency. Yeah. And he correctly, he will argue, and I believe correctly, that he is better positioned to win the general election, because he appeals more to the moderate voter who swings between the party, the sort of person who will say, I voted for Obama, but I can't vote for Hillary Clinton, will look at him as an acceptable alternative, while they will look at Cruz as somebody who they will have to take with castor oil. And I think John Kasich would say, no, Ted, 1, you can't win, I can. 2, you can't win to stop Trump going forward, I can. 2, you can't beat Hillary, or less likely to, I am. 3, you're younger, if you're my Veep, you succeed me.
So I've heard a number of times on television channels people saying John Kasich has no path to the nomination. But what I hear you saying is, let's say at some point, and it would probably be not done explicitly, maybe a little bit implicitly, or people contacting each other from various campaigns. The message from the Cruz campaign to the Kasich campaign is, let's work together, and you, John Kasich, will be my vice president. To which Kasich then responds,
back at you, babe.
Right. I'm older, you're younger, you, Ted Cruz, be my vice president.
That's right. That's exactly what why should John Kasich be, 1, the Cruz campaign should have made this offer 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
2, the Cruz campaign will be dragged kicking and screaming to making that offer, if they even see the need to make that offer, in part because if there is one thing that Ted Cruz is really well known for, apart from what has become a largely Christian conservative identity, it is that what will he do to Obamacare? Repeal it, every last word. What is John Kasich best known for in the last couple of years? Going to bat to expand Medicaid in this state under Obamacare. So putting Kasich on, he would have to explain why the chief apostate in the race ought to be his vice president. That will be a difficult thing for Ted Cruz to do. Ronald Reagan, it should be recalled, in 1976, to try and create a cartel to stop Gerald Ford, said before the convention, I will name Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania as my vice president. Now, why did he do that? Well, Pennsylvania and New York in those days were unbound. They were very liberal Republicans. By putting a liberal Republican, I mean really a liberal Republican, somebody to the left of Olympia Snow and Sue Collins, on as his vice president, he was trying to make an olive branch to say, you can be part of this. You don't have to vote for Gerald Ford. You can get a better deal with me. So, well, it didn't work for a host of reasons, but one of the things that happened was conservatives who had previously backed Reagan decided they were going to back Ford because he had shown to them that he wasn't conservative enough. Ted Cruz will have the same issue if he puts John Kasich on the ticket beforehand. It won't be as intense, and I think he can deal with it, but it's not an obstacle that he can simply ignore. So, the path for Kasich to the nomination is he has to start winning congressional districts. He did in Chicago. He won 3 congressional districts in Chicago. I think with Rubio out of the race, some of the Rubio people in an urban area will find him preferable. He wins 2 or 3 congressional districts in Wisconsin. He wins another 8 or 10 in New York. He wins a few in Pennsylvania. He maybe wins 1 or 2 in Maryland. That's his proportional. He wins 1 or 2 in Connecticut. Suddenly, John Kasich has 350 delegates. And then you go to California, and there are a number of California congressional districts that profile well for him. There's the proportional primaries in Oregon and Washington that also purport. You look and you say, from John Kasich's standpoint, I can go into the convention with 500 delegates, and Ted Cruz goes in with 800 delegates, and other people go in with about 250, and there's 100 or so that are unbound, and I'd have to add it all up, but basically your scenario there is Trump goes in with 1,000. I can win this on the 3rd ballot.
So if Trump doesn't win on the first ballot, he's toast.
Dead.
Yeah.
He's totally toast.
Okay.
I mean, because what happens after the first ballot is most of these delegates become unpledged. And what in most states is the case is that the delegates are allocated in the primary but selected by the party apparatus later. So you can bet that Kasich and the Bush people, not to resurrect Jeb Bush, but to stop Trump, and the Cruz people are using all of their power in the subsequent party conventions and district caucus conventions to get their people selected to be Trump delegates. Because after the first ballot, they can vote their consciences. Now, the fact is Donald Trump will declare, he will be angry, he will be upset, he will say that the fix was in and blah, 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 and he's going to revoke his pledge, run on as a third-party candidate. Fine, that's just going to happen. You have to accept that that's going to happen in order to stop Donald Trump.
And if Trump were to run as a third-party candidate, would that sink Republican chances?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, the Republicans are not going to win the only way it doesn't sink is if you have somebody like a Kasich who both starts to appeal to the soft Trump supporter, not the person who has undying loyalty to the Donald, but the sort of person who really wants to be practical, who really wants a solution to their issue of being left out in America. And you've got Hillary Clinton being an ineffective candidate. Could you then see a Trump getting 15 or 20% and a close 35-35 race between the other two? Yeah, you could see that. But it really would require somebody like a Kasich and a lot of moving parts to come together correctly.
Would Kasich have more appeal to most Trump voters than Cruz would?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, because you got to understand that the sort of person who is voting Donald Trump right now is not a movement conservative. The sort of person who's voting Donald Trump right now is the sort of person who doesn't place religion high on their priorities, who doesn't find Obamacare as an abomination, who doesn't find supply-side tax cuts to be the answer to everything. This is a person who wants to be part of America again. It's not to say that if Cruz were the nominee that a number of them wouldn't vote for Cruz. But as far as saying, if you look at the Trump voter and you say who is likelier to get a larger percentage of them, I think Kasich would be likelier to get a larger percentage of them than Cruz would.
Interesting. Questions from you? Let's say there's a microphone over there, there's a microphone over here. So raise your hands and ask away.
Hi, thank you very much for speaking to us today. In your opinion, what is the likelihood of having a brokered convention, and if so, who do you think the GOP will nominate?
You voiced likelihood of having a brokered convention and?
Who would the GOP nominate if that happened?
Right now I'd say the likelihood of a brokered convention is about 30%. We'll know better in about a month because all of these scenarios will have played out. I think if so much depends on how well whether Kasich stays in the race and whether he can win congressional districts. The thing to remember is that in most of these states from now on, it's winner take all by congressional district. Mm-hmm. If he can win congressional districts, then he can win enough that it'll become a brokered convention. If he can't, he either has to drop out or Cruz has to drop out in order to get it to be a brokered convention. If it were, then I think what you would find is that before you got to Cleveland, 2 of the 3 major competitors will have struck a deal so that it doesn't go to the floor. You know, which is to say that, let's say that Kasich does well, which is, Kasich does well, Cruz does about as well as I think Cruz is going to do. I haven't looked at the delegate counts in a while, so don't add up to 2473, which is the number of delegates in your head as I'm doing this. But let's say Kasich comes in with 450 and Cruz comes in with 800, and Rubio and the others have 200, and there's about 150 or so that are formally unbound. And then the remainder is at Trump. In any scenario like that, the temptation for 2 people to get up to beat the third person is high. This is what Kasich needs is enough leverage with enough delegates that he can cut the deal either way, which means he has to have enough delegates where adding him to one other person gets them comfortably over 1237. If that happens, then I think you'll see a deal cut. And who that deal is cut, I can't predict right now because so much depends on individuals and personalities. But I don't think if you have a scenario like I just outlined, that you will actually have a floor fight. I think what you will have is a deal cut going into Cleveland so that either Trump-Cruz or Cruz-Kasich or Kasich-Cruz gets presented and there's a clear majority. That it'll be fought on the floor, but as long as you hold your majority, you can win all of the proxy fights on rules and other things that are de rigueur of a contested convention and ultimately prevail.
But how can Trump strike a deal? Because, as you were saying, if he doesn't win on the first ballot, he's toast. He cannot, if he doesn't have the delegates pledged to him, he can't win on the first ballot, right? Because others are still pledged to other candidates.
It depends if he has to win on the first ballot. There's 2 ways to win on the first ballot. 2 ways to win on the first ballot is to have people pledged to you. The other way to win on the first ballot is to strike a deal so that you're getting the other person's votes.
But you can't get those other person's votes in the first ballot if they're pledged to another candidate.
What would have to happen is that candidate would have to drop out as part of that's the way this would work. As part of the deal. As part of the deal, you have to drop out on the first ballot, and you have to work heaven and earth for your delegates to move over. So let's say Trump goes in with 1,100 and Cruz has 700. Trump, Cruz together is 3/4 of the delegation. Trump president, Cruz vice president, Cruz gets out of the race, never lets his name be put in nomination, and instructs his delegates to vote for Trump.
Okay.
In that scenario, even if 75% of Cruz's voters disobeyed, said, no, I don't, Ted, you're a sellout, I was for you for president, but I'm not for you for vice president, he'd only need to persuade 25% to give Trump the nomination. So that's the scenario I'm talking about, is not a deal that prevents a second ballot from ever happening. But if no deal is cut, and if Trump does not win on the first ballot, his delegates largely become unbound, and he has no chance of winning on the subsequent ballots.
Okay. Other questions?
You mentioned that immigration is frequently on the lowest priorities for many voters, and yet we see Trump constantly hammering on immigration as one of his major rally speeches and policy issues, if you can call it that. And we see him winning occasionally by as much as 45 or 50% in non-border states. So do you think this is evidence that most of Trump's campaign is entirely the anger against the institution regardless of issues, or do you think it's attributed to something else? This is the thing, is that whenever I listen to Trump, not listen to the media, but actually listen to Trump, he talks about trade. He was more likely to say first, rather than build a wall, that China and Mexico are eating our lunch and that we don't win anymore. That's the base of his appeal. The media wants to focus on immigration because, one, he made a splash with that at first, and two, because it touches all of their buttons. But in fact, trade is more important to his coalition than immigration. I think there is a worldview of a segment of Americans. I wrote about it for years, as you're aware. That people have been, who are native-born Americans who do not have college degrees, have seen their income stagnate or decline, have seen their jobs dry up. They believe they face competition from foreigners in two ways. They believe they face competition from foreigners through free trade, and they believe they face competition from foreigners through illegal immigration. They believe that is depressing their wages and drying up their jobs. If it hasn't yet, they believe it'll happen in the future because they know it happened to somebody else. They believe that the people who run this country, Democrats, Republicans, media, academic, business, and political, care more about foreigners than they do about Americans. What Donald Trump says is that American citizenship matters. We are for Americans first. And that's what they have wanted to hear for 15 years. One thing I do want to mention, Donald Trump took his step to the presidency after the San Bernardino shootings. That his call to ban Muslim immigrants, I think, is one of the great underestimated impacts. He was consistently polling between 25 and 30% in most national polls. After San Bernardino, after his call, he broke 30% and he's never been below it. And how does that fit into the worldview? If you accept that the sort of person who accepts Trump feels that the people who run this country care more about foreigners than they do about Americans, the Muslim immigration question moves that from the economic sphere to the personal safety sphere. That they're willing to have a risk, they care more about the sensibility of foreigners when it could mean your life. It's not just your job anymore, it's not just your paycheck, it's your life. That crystallized the sense, and the fact that everyone condemned it once again for the people who have this worldview crystallized once again. They don't get it, they don't care, we're not part of America anymore, we are Americans. And if you take a look at the polls, when they ask the questions, they ask questions about, sometimes they will ask questions, do you believe that there should be a legal path to residency, or that you should deport illegal aliens? In Republican primary, this Republican electorate where Donald Trump wins, consistently in states, a majority of Republican primary voters choose a path to legalization. Almost 3/4 of Republicans favor the Muslim ban. I ask you which is more important when considering what's motivating Donald Trump supporters.
Interesting.
And I also ask you that it is telling that until the Michigan primary, no exit poll asked a question about trade. It is a blind spot that exists across partisan boundaries, but separates class in America.
Hey, thank you for coming. Just had a question concerning how John Kasich can actually expand his base and try and somehow siphon off Trump's supporters. What do you think he can do going forward in those states to actually get some of the people who support Trump because of trade and the Muslim issue?
He needs what he needs to do is he can't, because of his voter, he can't compete on the Muslim issue. The sort of person who he has chosen to base his campaign on are the very sort of people who like his opposition to Trump on the Muslim issue. But what he can do is start to talk more about trade. He can talk more about, as you know, I live in Ohio, I'm the governor of Ohio, I know how hard this is, I'm going to have he needs to start engaging more on that ground. And what Trump will do is say, yeah, but you supported all these trade deals, and he has to have a good, when he was in Congress. And what he has to do is have a good answer to that. But if you're not going to get inside that Trump supporter's mindset, all you're doing is fighting over the remaining non-Trump support. And what's quite clear is that the sort of person who's animated to vote for Ted Cruz is highly unlikely to find John Kasich attractive. The sort of person who's voting for John Kasich is highly unlikely to find Ted Cruz attractive. So it's not like there's a lot of votes you're going to get by having a Kasich-Cruz battle.
Yeah, I had two questions, if that's okay, actually. The first is...
If it's okay with your fellow students.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Both concern what would happen if Trump were to somehow not get the nomination. So the first is whether you think Trump supporters would move to any candidate in a general election, even the GOP nominee, considering how little Trump supporters seem to have supported other candidates in the past, the people who haven't voted at all, people who don't like anything related to the political system. And then the second question is, I'm actually from Cleveland, and so a lot of my friends that live in the downtown area are already starting to wonder if Trump doesn't win the nomination, whether there'll be rioting, whether they should just get a hotel out of the city for the weekend. So maybe not specifically asking about what you think will happen back home come the convention, but afterwards, how do you see Trump supporters responding to no longer having a candidate? Will they still be active in the political system? Do you think they're still going to try to argue that there's been a conspiracy, or will they just disappear?
I think it's highly likely that if Trump goes to Cleveland with a plurality of delegates and walks out without the nomination, that he runs a write-in campaign. That how hard is it to write in Trump? That he would have legitimate say, look, the voters wanted me, the corrupt bosses who, blah, 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 we can take this country back. So then I think they would come out and vote for Trump. They would be disposed to do it. Whether they do depends a lot on who the candidates are and what the nominations look like and what sort of events happen in the world, but they would be predisposed to do that. If Trump, against my expectations, were to both lose the nomination and abide by his pledge to endorse the nominee, I think, and if he were, as I would expect, not the vice president, he's already pretty much said he won't take it, but people have said they're not interested before and changed their mind. A lot would depend on the informal signals that he sent. Ronald Reagan endorsed Gerald Ford and didn't do a whole lot. in 1976. His voters came out and largely supported Ford, but not with a lot of enthusiasm. Trump voters are much more disengaged from the party than Reagan voters were from the Republicans in 76. I think if Trump issued a pro forma endorsement and did a little more than appear at a couple of rallies, a lot of them would not vote. I think that they would find they would likely find the Republican nominee to be not terribly appealing. The exception, I think, would be a properly executed Kasich campaign. But if it's a Cruz campaign, I mean, Cruz would go and try and campaign on his newfound opposition to trade and his support of Donald's position on immigration. But Cruz doesn't talk in the way that Trump does. Cruz has basically grafted these ideas onto Washington, D.C. movement conservatism. And when he says that, he immediately starts to pivot to phrases and code words that appeal to the movement conservative but don't appeal to the person who's not a movement conservative. So I don't think Cruz, while he will try, will have a whole lot of effect in breaking through. I think Hillary Clinton will point out a lot of ways in which Cruz is exactly the sort of Republican that these voters have never liked. As for your friends in Cleveland, what's their taste for risk? I do not think that there will be riots. I do think that if Trump were not the nominee, there would be isolated outbreaks of physical violence. You know, somebody who's there to support Trump. And some of it also depends, if I were Trump, I might consider asking my voters who were not delegates to come to Cleveland to rally for me. I'd say, you know, I need your support. The people who run this convention need to know that you matter, and you can't come into the floor, but you can come into the city. Come to the city. If I were Trump, I would do that. And if I did that, then I would expect that some of my people would, out of anger, engage in random acts of violence. Not a riot, but beating somebody up who's wearing a Cruz thing, or, you know, getting into an altercation with a media person or something. So, you know, what's your appetite for risk? If you want to be see a historical moment, stay in Cleveland. If you're like me and I lived in New York in 2004 and the convention came to New York and I thought there might be a terrorist thing, I went to Maine that week. My appetite for risk was real low.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. We have to stop now because there's another event that'll be starting here shortly, and also it's time anyway. Just let me end with two things. Number one, tomorrow, 11:30 a.m., Kim Holmes, former Assistant Secretary of State, former Heritage Foundation Vice President, is coming. He has a book that'll be coming out soon called The Closing of the Liberal Mind, a very incisive analysis of what's going on in America. And so if you want to be the first on your block to be familiar with his arguments and ask him questions and meet him, 11:30 tomorrow morning. And secondly, please join me in thanking very much Henry Olsen.
Thank you. This is fun. Thanks, Marvin.
Yeah.